Welcome to our overview for Sunday school teachers and Bible study leaders of Lifeway's Explore the Bible lesson of 1 Thessalonians 5, 1 through 11 for Sunday, April 17th, 2022, with the title of Returning. One way to begin this lesson would be to ask your class or just to share, have you or someone you know ever thought you knew when the Lord was going to return? Or maybe you even thought it was happening. I can remember vividly back in the new year of 1981, sitting on a bunk bed at camp at Falls Creek, Oklahoma, at the youth camp, being up very late at night, thinking about how I knew the Lord was going to return that year. To me, it was all spelled out. Israel had become a nation in 1948. Jesus said this generation won't pass away until all these things take place. The generation was 40 years. That makes 1988. Take away 7 years for the tribulation. That means he had to come in 1981. I just remember sitting up late at night on that bunk bed, just soberly pondering how the Lord was going to return that very year. Of course, he didn't. And that has now been over 41 years ago. Incredible. There's a lot of stories like that. You can feel free to share mine. Maybe you have one like that, or someone you know does, or someone in your class does. You could share as you begin class. But there have been many all through history who thought they knew when the return of the Lord was. One of the most famous was a little booklet I received when I was pastoring in my first church in Oklahoma City by a former NASA engineer. It was entitled 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. 88 reasons, spelled out by a NASA engineer. But it didn't happen. And picking a date like that is not new. It has happened all throughout Christian history. You might want to use some of these either here in the opening or maybe later on in your lesson as we talk about it. But one of the most famous happened in 1844, led by a Baptist preacher of all things by the name of William Miller. Miller's study of Daniel 8 led him to believe the Lord would return on October 22nd, 1844. Miller was very persuasive, and many people followed him, selling their possessions, selling their property, which they weren't going to need if the Lord was going to come back. They all gathered together, but the 22nd came, and Jesus didn't. This occasion has gone down in history as being called the Great Disappointment. It's of note the Seventh-day Adventist religious group came out of this disappointment. They taught, well, Jesus didn't return to earth that day, but he entered the heavenly sanctuary on that day. And of course, that can't be proved. But Mark Twain, writing in the 1860s after the Great Disappointment, said that a similar thing happened while he was on a trip in Turkey, in the biblical city of Smyrna. He wrote, "A gentleman tells me that they had it all set for the world to come to an end in Smyrna one day about 3 years ago. There was much buzzing and preparation for a long time previously. It culminated in a wild excitement at the appointed time. A vast number of the populace ascended the Citadel Hill early in the morning to get out of the way of the general destruction. Many of the infatuated closed up their shops and retired from all their earthly business." He said the strange part of it was about 3 p.m, a terrific storm of rain, accompanied by thunder and lightning, broke forth and continued with dire fury for 2 or 3 hours. It was a thing unprecedented in Smyrna at that time of year and scared some of the most skeptical. The streets ran rivers, the hotel floor was flooded with water, dinner had to be suspended. He said when the storm finished and everybody was drenched through and through, melancholy and half drowned, the Ascensionists came down from the mountain. Of course, it didn't happen then either. In Edward Dolnick's book, The Clockwork Universe, he talks about Isaac Newton and the scientific revolution of the 1600s. He says there were all kinds of date setting back then in the 1600s too. They picked up on the 1260 days of Daniel, and they marked it from 400 AD, which they believed was the onset of special wickedness in the world. So it's easy to see 1260 plus 400 makes 1660. They just knew 1660 was going to be the year the Lord would return and the world would end. More recently, there's been the blood moons fad. Some of y'all may have read or heard about that. All these blood moons were supposedly pointing to the beginning of the last days, and some seemingly good preachers and teachers and churches were talking about it and getting caught up in it. That's several years ago now, and literally nothing came out of it. There's numerous occurrences all through history, which is why the Lord tells us, do not speculate about days and times, which is what today's lesson is about. Now, just to give it a little context before the Easter lesson we had from Matthew last week, we were looking at 1 Thessalonians 4, where Paul was likely answering questions and concerns from the Thessalonians about their deceased loved ones. Had they missed the return of the Lord? He says no. In fact, they're going to rise first. And he talked about the return of Christ and some of the things that would accompany it. Now, as chapter 5 begins, he talks about the timing of the Lord's return. When is it going to be? The timing of the Lord's return has been a question ever since the first days of Christianity. If you remember in Acts 1, Jesus is about to leave his disciples and they ask him in verse 6, Lord, is it at this time that you're restoring the kingdom to Israel? It's instructive. Jesus' answer then is the same as Jesus' answer now. He said in verse 7, it is not for you to know times or epochs which the Father has fixed by his own authority, but you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses. He gives the famous Acts 1:8 commission. So right from the beginning, Jesus says, number one, it is not for you to know the time. And number two, you focus on the mission that I'm giving to you. That's still a good word for us today, and I think it'd be a good way to divide up this lesson today. Point number one, you do not know the time of the Lord's return. And point number two, we need to be ready and be about his business. The first point, of course, we can't know the time of the Lord's return. After discussing the return in chapter 4, Paul opens chapter 5 saying, now as to the times and the epochs, brethren, you have no need of anything to be written to you. Why didn't they have any need of anything to be written to them? He answers that in verse 2. For you yourselves know full well the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. You might ask your group, what does it mean that it's going to come like a thief in the night? And of course, the answer is it means it's going to be a surprise. No one would expect it. No one saw it coming, just like no one saw the thief might steal something from your house. And then you might just ask them to look at the passage and say, what things do you see in this text that indicate that the Lord's return will be a surprise? Among those things are verse 2, it's going to come like a thief in the night. Verse 3 says, while they're saying peace and safety, destruction will come upon them suddenly. It's going to be a surprise. Verse 3 says it's going to be like labor pains upon a woman with child. By the way, our daughter-in-law is expecting literally right now, any minute. And in fact, Monday, the doctor said she's at a 2 already. She should have the baby anywhere from 2 to 48 hours from now. This is now Thursday, the day I'm recording this. 4 days later, we're still waiting. No one knows when that baby is coming. And the Bible says, listen, that's how it is with the return of the Lord too. No one knows when it's going to be. So the Bible really emphasizes that here. We do not know when the Lord will return. Don't ever get caught up in those teachers and teachings that seem to know or point to a date or time. We saw all those examples from history. If you didn't use them before, you might use them at this point. Just like people study the Bible, just like William Miller did, they look at current events. Miller was looking at the French Revolution, the tumult around it in the 1800s, and figured that all these things have to work together. This is going to be the end. As wise Christians, we're going to know this has been going on all through history. This is nothing new. Some people today think Putin is the Antichrist. That's not new. Virtually every bad guy ever since the time of Christ has been thought to be the Antichrist. I just finished reading a biography of Napoleon. Many in the early 1800s just knew Napoleon was the Antichrist. Martin Luther thought his Pope was the Antichrist in the 1500s. On and on. We've got to know these historical facts and be warned by them and not get carried away by these false predictions. Jesus said in Matthew 24, there will be a lot of false prophets and false Christs and false claims of his coming. But he said, do not believe them. He said in verse 27, just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. He said in verses 30 and 31, he'll come on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. He'll send forth his angels with a great trumpet and gather together his people from one end of the sky to the other. Jesus said, listen, don't be taken in by these things. When I come, it's going to be sudden. It's going to be glorious. It's going to be unmistakable. And we do not know when it is going to be. It's one of the key lessons of 1 Thessalonians 5, 1 through 3. We don't know when his return will be. Stop trying to date it and don't believe those who do. Now, the second thing we see in this passage in verses 4 through following is that we as Christians should be ready for the return of the Lord. He says in verse 4, the day should not overtake you, Christian person, like a thief. And verse 6 speaks of two attitudes that we as Christians should have to the return of Christ. Number one, he says, be alert. And number two, he says, be sober. Alert means we're watching for it. We're not going to be surprised by it. We're watching for it every day. In 1776, George Washington and the defending Americans were awaiting what they knew was going to be the coming British invasion of New York during the Revolution. But they didn't just sit there waiting every day. Author David McCullough says they worked on their defenses, they did military drills, they got ready for that invasion they knew that was coming. He wrote, "The thought that the British could appear at any time was seldom out of mind. Every soldier, every civilian, it seemed, had one eye cocked on the harbor for the first sign of the British sails. Every waking day began with the thought that this could be the day." What a great attitude that we should have as Christians as well. We ought to begin every day with the thought, this could be the day. Be alert, be sober, be watching, and be about your duty. Those Americans that were watching for the British, they didn't just watch, they got ready. They prepared their defenses. They were going about their duty. And that's the way that we should be as Christians too. Be ready for the Lord's return and be doing your duty. Be doing what God has called you to do in the meantime. One thing you could ask your class at this point is, what are some things that we should do and not do to be ready for the Lord's return? Well, to summarize it, we could say we should not be doing sins that we know are wrong, and we should be doing the ministries and the good works that He has called us to do. Find your ministry and be doing the things that God has called you to do. I love the story that Jesus uses in Matthew 24. He said, "Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time?" He said, "Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. But if that wicked slave says in his heart, my master's not coming for a long time, and shall begin to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, he said, the master of that slave will come on a day he does not know, an hour he does not expect, and shall assign him a place with the hypocrites." Excuse me. Two things about that slave. Number one, he was doing things he shouldn't have done, beating his fellow slaves, eating and drinking with drunkards. Number two, he was not doing what he'd been called to do, to give them their food at the proper time. Those same two things apply to us in being ready for the Lord's return. Don't be doing things you shouldn't. Keep your life free from sin. A good rule is, don't do anything you wouldn't want the Lord to find you doing when He comes. And number two, do be faithful to the ministry that God has called you to do when He comes. I remember when I was a grocery stocker in high school, a manager told us, always stay busy, always be arranging things and putting things up on the shelves. She said, I might occasionally stop in when you're not expecting it. I want you to be found doing what I've told you to do when I come. Occasionally, she did stop in randomly, and it was always good. I always felt good to be found doing what she told us to be doing when she came. You can use my story if you'd like. You may have a story like that too from your own life or one that you know of. But that's how it's going to be with the coming of the Lord. This is a challenge to us all. Number one, know what God has called you to do in ministry. And if you don't know, find out what He wants you to be doing. Then number two, when you know what He wants you to do it. Be faithful to do it and keep on doing it until Jesus comes. Just like me and that grocery store manager, be found doing what you're ordered to do when He comes. All right, well, there's a whole lot more here as always. I hope this will help you at least get started this week and give you some historical examples and stories that might help you share this week. As always, if you'll write something in the comment section below, I'll be sure and pray for you and your group by name this weekend. God bless you as you teach His Word this week.